The most significant thing that I heard the president say is that he's the chief law enforcement officer of this country. And it's not typical that the president would come into the Department of Justice and announce that. That suggests that he intends to have a hands-on role in the work that the Department of Justice is doing, which has always historically been a non-political institution. What's so interesting about how this administration is approaching it is that they are rooting out the career workforce, which historically have been the ones who have done most of the work to uphold our laws, to keep us safe, to protect our civil rights, in favor of political appointees who will carry out the president's agenda. It really is just consistent with this idea that the president believes that the department is his own personal law firm, and that is the view that appears to have been taken by all of the leaders of the Department of Justice, all of whom, in fact, were the president's personal attorneys and appear not to have been able to make any pivot toward realizing that the Constitution and the people of the United States are, in fact, their client now.
And that is at the center of why you left the department. You were asked to do something that was clearly a favor to a political ally for Mel Gibson. Will you tell us your story?
Sure. Yeah. So my position as pardon attorney has traditionally been a career reserved position, meaning that it is intended to be non-political. The Office of the Pardon Attorney plays the role of essentially ensuring that people who do not have political connections, people who do not have access to the White House through the front door, can still have access to the clemency system. We've seen many examples across multiple political administrations of pardons being doled out as favors to friends and family and loyalists. My role as pardon attorney is to ensure it's not, frankly, to try to talk the president out of doing those things. It's to ensure that other people who are regular people who don't have resources or money or access can also be considered for those same government benefits. So what was surprising to me was when I was initially asked to take on a completely different work stream. The Office of the Pardon Attorney was tasked several weeks before my departure with taking on a completely new work stream, which was to review individuals who were seeking restoration of their firearm rights and to make recommendations to the Attorney General about returning them the right to possess firearms. We approached this project with the same perspective that we approach clemency recommendations, meaning trying to focus on those ordinary individuals who might be deserving. And in the case of pardon applicants, we generally have quite a bit of information about them by the time we make a recommendation, in large part because we are aware that one of the benefits of getting a presidential pardon is that you can lawfully purchase a firearm. So we focused on that pool of individuals who had been recommended to the president for a full pardon. We identified 95 individuals who had been thoroughly vetted, and we provided that group of individuals to the staff of the Deputy Attorney General for their consideration as potential candidates. The staff in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General whittled that group of 95 down to 9 individuals, and they asked me to prepare a memo to the Attorney General recommending that they were suitable candidates for relief. I was able to comfortably do that because those were all individuals that, as I said, I knew quite a bit about, and they were people who had very old convictions, all for nonviolent crimes, and all had demonstrated exemplary conduct across decades since. I provided that memo to the Deputy Attorney General's senior staff, and it was sent back to me with the statement requesting that I add Mel Gibson to the memo. I reviewed a letter from Mel Gibson's attorney, which was the only information provided to me about him, and it essentially made the case that Mel Gibson is a famous actor who has a personal relationship with the president, and that would be sufficient reason to grant him his right to a firearm. It also noted that Mr. Gibson had attempted to purchase a firearm in 2023 and that he was denied because of his prior conviction for domestic violence. Based on that information, I was not comfortable making that recommendation. I view returning firearms to people with a history of domestic violence as potentially very dangerous. And I certainly did not have enough information in front of me about Mr. Gibson to set aside those concerns and make that recommendation. I communicated to the staff in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General that I could not make that recommendation. And, I had a great deal of trepidation about making that statement, because it was my understanding, based on the environment in the department, that it's very it's disfavored to raise objections or to express dissenting views. So I was not surprised to receive a call several hours later from a senior staffer for the Deputy Attorney General that began as a friendly conversation and descended into him essentially advising me that Mel Gibson has a personal relationship with the president, and that should be all I need to know to be comfortable making this recommendation, and that I would be wise to make the recommendation.
Was that Todd Blanche? Who was that conversation with?
That was with one of the senior staff members. The Deputy Attorney General has several associate deputies, and this was one of the associate deputy attorney generals. He asked me to do that. I spent a sleepless night understanding that if I didn't comply with that request, it would likely result in me losing my ability to participate in future conversations about this whole endeavor. That was very concerning to me, because my understanding was that Mel Gibson was to be used as an example to start a whole process by which we would be returning firearms to individuals with domestic violence convictions as well as other types of convictions. So ultimately, it wasn't even a close call for me, frankly. I couldn't do it. I agonized over how to deliver the news that I couldn't do it. Words have to be chosen very carefully if you want to be able to stay in the conversation in the Department of Justice now. So I spent a sleepless night mulling it over, and in the morning I wrote a message saying essentially that I was not able to make the recommendation that was sought, and I confided in one of my colleagues that I believed that Mel Gibson was likely to be my downfall. And several hours after communicating that, I received the notice that there were security officers back in my office looking for me to deliver a termination notice to me. I returned to my office, they gave me the paper, and I was escorted out of the Department of Justice.
Elizabeth, you said that it became clear that this was part of a process of returning firearms to domestic violence convictions. Will you say more about that process?
Yes. So this whole issue arose in the context of a working group that was created, I was told, at the direction of the Attorney General to develop a process to restore firearm rights to people with criminal convictions. Currently, under federal law, if you have a felony conviction or if you have a misdemeanor domestic violence conviction, you are prohibited from possessing a gun. The Attorney General announced that it was a priority to find a way to restore gun rights to at least some individuals who had these types of convictions. And a working group was formed. I was asked to participate in the working group. And my initial understanding was that we were seeking to find ways to return guns to people who had nonviolent crimes and who had demonstrated good conduct and did not pose a continuing threat to public safety. However, it was discussed in one of these meetings that we also needed to find a way to include individuals who had prior convictions for domestic violence offenses. This was puzzling to me because domestic violence is the type of offense where it's really dangerous to bring a firearm into the mix. To my surprise, no one in the room readily raised any objection to including those types of offenses, and I felt that I needed to do that. So I spoke a couple of times with the same individual in the DAG's office who ultimately directed me to add Mel Gibson about my concerns about including individuals with domestic violence histories. I also raised in the working group these concerns with others who I knew shared those concerns, and I knew understood that the data and the facts all indicate that it is a very bad idea to put firearms into the hands of domestic abusers. So I raised this issue and was told that it was being taken into consideration and that my concerns were understood and being addressed. And next thing I knew, I was being asked to make this recommendation as to Mel Gibson, which came as an especially great surprise given the position that I had taken in the meetings. But it is my understanding that there is an intent on the part of the Attorney General to stand up a broader process in which individuals with a wide variety of types of criminal convictions, including domestic violence misdemeanors, will be eligible to apply for reinstatement of their gun rights.